I told you yesterday I was doing a little bit of research. Well, actually, I was working with two of my buddies, Craig Shirley and Borko Komnenovic. Shirley is one of the great experts on Ronald Reagan, and Borko works with him and is a great patriot, originally born in communist Yugoslavia. And I asked them to help me pull together some information about Reagan running in '76 because when I was involved in that campaign, I remember he was under withering attack from Republicans, from so-called conservative columnists. And the reason I decided to look into this is because I see the same thing happening with Ted Cruz, our good friend Tom Thole, our good friend Mona Charen. But they're not alone. Others just dumping and dumping and dumping. And I said, gee, this seems familiar. And it did ring a bell. A bell almost, 40 years ago. Almost 40 years ago. So I want you conservatives, constitutionalists, Tea Party activists, just Americans generally to understand we've been here before. We've been under assault for daring to challenge the ruling class and the establishment. And I wanted to remind you about it because I think it's interesting. I can't spend all day on it. I've got way too much I want to get to because there's a lot of very important things going on. But if I don't do this, nobody will. So Ronald Reagan, it was well known by 1974, he put together Citizens for the Republic, and he was preparing to run for president, although he hadn't announced. And George Will wrote a number of scathing columns, personally attacking Reagan. And he said in part, here's a column in the Washington Compost, November 12, 1974, and the title is Ronald Reagan, the GOP, and 76, meaning 1976. And part of what he wrote, it was a really lousy, nasty column, but I can't read it all, but part of what he wrote, I really want you to listen to this, is, but Reagan is 63, he wrote, and looks it. His hair is still remarkably free of gray, but around the mouth and neck he looks like an old man. He's never demonstrated substantial national appeal. His hardcore support today consists primarily of the kamikaze conservatives, I guess they call us purists now, ladies and gentlemen, who thought the 1964 Goldwater campaign was jolly fun. And there's a reason to doubt that Reagan is well suited to appeal to the electorate that just produced a Democratic landslide. If a Reagan third party would just lead the Nixon was lynched crowd away from the Republican Party and into outer darkness where there is a wailing and gnashing of teeth, it might be at worst a mixed course for the Republican Party. It would cost the party some support, but it would make the party seem cleansed. That's Will smearing Reagan and conservatives who supported him, telling them, get lost, you can't win, it's going to be a disaster, and we need a cleansed party. And there's so many examples by so many. Former Republican Senator Chuck Percy of Illinois, considered a moderate to liberal Republican at the time, he said in 1975 to the New York Slimes, a Reagan nomination and the crushing defeat likely to follow could signal the beginning of the end of our party as an effective force in American life. Percy described as far out of the centrist stream, he described Reagan. Representative John Rhodes, Republican of Arizona, a moderate Republican. He became leader of the Republicans in the House, by the way. 1975, as soon as Reagan gets away from his cliches and his campaign slogans, he's in trouble. And I noticed throughout a lot of this, they play up Reagan as the doofus, as the guy that doesn't understand policy. And yet the amazing thing is Reagan was enormously well read. He was very deep. And his personal library had hundreds and hundreds of books from philosophers and so forth that you would never find in Barack Obama's library or George Bush's or any of them. 1975, Vice President Nelson Rockefeller warned Republican governors in terms of Reagan's run, no major American party, he said, can long endure by directing its appeal to a narrow minority. It will not serve the nation to have our major parties polarized at ideological extremes. That was Rockefeller. Remember the context. Reagan was rising up, building a conservative movement to take on whom? Gerald Ford and the establishment Republicans in Washington. He was preparing to run in a primary against a sitting Republican president. Can you imagine what they would say on Fox, what they would say at National Review and the Weekly Standard? Can you imagine what they would say on the pages of the Washington Compost with the pseudo-conservatives and all the rest? Republican Representative Pete McCluskey of California said a Reagan win would mean a disaster for the GOP. He said in 1976, Representative James Cleveland, Republican New Hampshire, he predicted another Goldwater debacle if Reagan is the GOP nominee. Houston Flournoy, California State Controller, frontrunner for the California governorship in 1974 at that time, he told the Washington Compost's David Broder in 1974, the Republican Party's opportunity for victories in California and the nation depends upon the candidates it selects, the issues it develops. It's obvious that no major Republican candidates are going to be elected without the increasingly necessary support of Democratic voters. For a Republican to win in California, he must demonstrate convincingly that he is a progressive, problem-solving candidate, avoiding extremism on either end of the political spectrum. In 1976, Mills Godwin, the Republican governor of Virginia, publicly told Reagan to get out of the race against Ford. So did the Republican governor of North Carolina, Jim Holshouser. And on the eve of the North Carolina primary, the Ford White House orchestrated a telegram signed by a dozen Republican governors telling Reagan to get out. And Reagan won North Carolina, as I recall. So Reagan gets ready again. He almost defeats a sitting Republican president. And he, by the way, Gerald Ford and others blamed him for Ford's loss against Carter, just as they blame us for the Republican inability to win the Senate, just as they blame us every time they lose. And yet it was their candidate who lost. They lost. But in 1979, when Reagan was getting ready to run again, he was trashed again by George Will. He was trashed over and over again, including in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. November of 1979, when he announced his candidacy, among other things, the Wall Street Journal editorial page wrote, "For political packaging, we do not need to turn to a 68-year-old man." And there's so much of this, ladies and gentlemen, that we just started pulling together. And I decided to undertake this little project and present it to you today again. Because if you look on the Internet, if you look at your newspapers, you're going to find some very odd columns from people you admire, trashing Ted Cruz, attacking the Tea Party. And what I'm telling you is, this isn't new. Almost 40 years ago from today, it was done to Ronald Reagan when he took on Gerald Ford. It was also done to Ronald Reagan when he took on the establishment in 1979 to win the 1980 Republican nomination for president. I wanted to give you a little bit of history because I want you to remain motivated and inspired, and I want you to understand that Reagan took the same course as you and I, as we are pushing today. He saw the country unraveling under Jimmy Carter. He saw a Republican Party incapable of doing anything about it, offering no vision, rejecting its own principles. Losers. And that's exactly what they were, and that's exactly what they are today. When they say Reagan couldn't win today, that's just bullcrap. Reagan would be nominated going away today. It would be the same establishment fighting him now as fought him before. And when he finally muscled through after his third try and won the Republican nomination, and he was fought in 1980, fought by the Bush brothers. He was fought by George H.W. Bush and Howard Baker and Bob Dole and all the rest. They needed to derail him. They said it would be a disaster. He won one of the biggest popular vote landslides and electoral vote landslides in American history, only to be outdone the second time he ran. Because conservative principles, when put into practice, work. That's what we stand for. That's what we're doing. So we need to overcome those who are standing in our way within the Republican Party, even so-called conservatives and pseudo-conservatives. They are perfectly happy with what's going on. They actually believe just winning the Senate with Republicans, not conservatives, just Republicans, will somehow deliver us. Nothing's going to deliver us except us. 1980 was the third biggest electoral landslide in American history, after 1936 and 1972. The man who was extremist, the man who couldn't win, Mr. Conservative, My buddy Craig Shirley likes to tell people that Ronald Reagan wasn't Ronald Reagan before Ronald Reagan was Ronald Reagan. In other words, everybody likes to talk about Ronald Reagan, but before they embraced him, they denounced him. That is, before he was a winner. Now, I want to demonstrate to you exactly what I'm talking about. Here's George Will, 1974. This is 40 years ago, trashing Ronald Reagan and the conservatives who supported him as Reagan was preparing to take on a sitting, moderate, establishment, rhino, Republican president, Gerald Ford. And he says in part about Reagan, he has never demonstrated substantial national appeal. His hardcore support today consists primarily of the kamikaze conservatives who thought the 1964 Goldwater campaign was jolly fun. Kamikaze conservatives. So I'm thinking to myself, well, that sounds familiar. And a buddy of mine, David, sends me an email and says, well, that is familiar. And he pointed out to me that was in a Wall Street Journal column yesterday in the attack on Ted Cruz. Groups like, who wrote this? Kimberly Strassel. Her title is Misguided Cruise Missile. Ha ha, funny. And she writes in part, groups like the Senate Conservatives Fund and Heritage Action want to replace the leadership with more of their own kamikaze caucus. They talk the same way. They write the same way. They're losers the same way. The Wall Street Journal that opposed Ronald Reagan, trashing conservatives, using George Will's language. Shouldn't George Will at least get $20 or $50 for that? So this is what we're up against, but I'm telling you this so you have some hope, so you stay motivated and strong as we get into the 2014 election cycle, and then later we get into the Republican primary process. We are going to fight for the best, most articulate, most knowledgeable, the most competent, most visionary conservative we can. We're going to fight like hell. We're going to fight the rhinos. We're going to fight the Republican establishment. We're going to fight the media. And maybe for once, we will crush these bastards. Because that's the way we save our country, at least temporarily. We need to do Article 5, but I'm not going there right now. We're the kamikazes. Seems to me they ought to be turning their fire on Barack Obama. He's the kamikaze. He's the one taking the nation into the crapper. He's the one spending us into oblivion. And the Democrats, all happy to do it, and the Republicans sit there with the stupid smiles on their face. This isn't a game anymore. This is serious. So they trashed Reagan. They demeaned him. Character assassination. From the Wall Street Journal, from George Will, from his own party, from the leaders in his own party, from the Republican National Committee. He was the outsider who fought them and broke through. You listen to so many of these other hosts. You listen to these goofballs on TV going on and on. You have to win the fight. You have to win the fight. You have to fight to win. You have to make your case to the American people. And let me tell you something. I think the American people are starving for a leader. I think the American people are craving a leader. When they see one who has answers that are based on liberty and private property and hard work and savings, that is somebody who doesn't want to fundamentally transform America, but somebody who wants to save the republic. That's what we're talking about.